In the second Fear and Hunger game, the longer one is exposed to the scorching light of the moon, the more transformed they'll become, with non-contestants going through stages of evolution like demented Pokemon. One evolutionary line starts with the villagers, then the bobbies, and finally going full Stinger ahead in the final evolution. At one of the bunkers, we can find a film of an experiment, with the subject being slowly exposed to the light of the moon. At the beginning they look like a normal person, then they turn into something similar to the villagers, and finally they turn into a bobby. This quite directly connects the first stage, the villagers, with the second stage, the bobbies. Connecting the bobbies and the final stage is a bit less direct, and we'll need to use the medical diagnosis skill from Dan's skill tree in order to do so. A diagnosis of a body of a bobby will tell us that there is a thick layer of exoskeleton-like growth all over the person. The surface looks like old burn damage for the most part, but in certain places the surface has begun to harden into a glossy shell. This shell that is starting to form in the bobbies is covering their entire body by the time they transform into a bellend, with a diagnosis of the creature telling us that it has a sturdy shell-like exoskeleton. There is also a trend starting with the villagers and bobbies of the skin being more and more burnt the further one is exposed to the scorching light of the moon. The villagers have normal human skin that is severely burnt and blistered. The bobbies have skin that mostly looks like it has old burn damage, with some of the skin still looking normal. And then finally, the bellends are the next and final natural step, with their skin being burned to a crisp, looking more like hardened leather than human skin. Another thing connecting the different stages is that the head is the most moonscorched part of the body. We can see it in the very first stage with the villager. The man has severe burns and malformations around his body, especially on his face. The blisters on his face are festering, but at the same time parts of his face have dried up to a crisp, seemingly from the inside out. Now, oddly enough, the diagnosis of the bobby doesn't mention the head at all, but just from how they look, we can see that the strand of the head being especially transformed continues here as well. More specifically, the helmet is fused together with the head, permanently blinding them and sealing off their noses. The only recognizable facial feature left is the mouth, which is now joined by another. By the time they transform into a bellend, no part of the face is left exposed, with the entire head being cocooned in layers of thick bio-armor. The helmet from the previous stage is now stretched and enlarged, serving as a kind of new skull of the creature, and giving it its iconic stinger head look, which it was named after. In conclusion, we have a lot of evidence that tie the different stages of this evolutionary line quite nicely. First, we have the film of the experiment that shows us quite directly a villager transforming into a bobby. Then, by using the medical diagnosis skill, we can see that in the most moonscorched part of the bobby, they start to develop the shell that covers the entirety of the bellends. In addition, by looking at the character sprites, we can see that the helmet that got fused together with the head in the Bobby stage is still there in the balance stage, and in fact is the thing that gives it the balance shape. And on top of all that, there are trends that continue throughout the different stages, like the skin being more and more scorched with each stage, and the head always being the most heavily transformed body part. Lastly, at the very end of the diagnosis of the balance, we get a confirmation that this is indeed a final stage in Moonscorching evolution. As it says, if this creature was once a human, you suspect it is at the end of its metamorphosis by now. Now, before we continue into possible different variants and new evolutionary lines altogether, there is an interesting thing we can learn about Moonscorching as a whole from the locations where we can find each stage of this line. The first stage, the villagers, are found outside the city altogether. The second stage, the bobbies, are in the outer layer of the city. And the final stage, the balance, are in the very middle of the city, right around the moon tower. Which means that the closer you are to the tower, the stronger the exposure to the light of the moon is. Which makes sense as the unnaturally close moon is right near the tower in the sky. Let's continue to a possible variant of this line. Just like the bobbies are obviously police officers who got transformed into the second stage of this line, so are the inquisitors clergymen who got transformed to a similar stage but going in a bit of a different direction. Their heads are very similar to the ones of the bobbies. They also have multiple mouths that look exactly the same, and their headwear is also merged with their head. However, they don't do the Jacob's Ladder, Silent Hill, aggressive head-twitching thing that the bobbies do. Yet the heads is where the similarities to the bobbies stop. While the bobbies have 3 arms that they can rapidly regrow if they're cut off, the inquisitors only have 1 that never grows back. Furthermore, using the medical diagnosis skill, we can see that while the bodies of the bobbies are solid and tough, the bodies of the inquisitors are soft. A medical diagnosis of an inquisitor tells us that this creature is but a sack of dried up skin that feels oily and viscous. The only thing that feels solid and firm is its head. This is why the bobbies are resilient to most physical attacks, while the inquisitors are the exact opposite, being weak to them. Now, before we continue to other evolutionary lines, I would like to highlight how tragic the situation the bobbies and the inquisitors are in. If you try and talk to the bobbies, they'll tell you this.
You have violated the martial law set by the High Priest of the area of Briarville and its surroundings. The law broken, everyone must stay indoors. The protocol to use lethal force. No, you are contaminated. There is no way back anymore. You know well enough. Tainted.
It seems that in an attempt to stop people from transforming and gain some control of the situation, the High Priest of the Church of Olmir decided to declare martial law and use the police to force everyone to stay inside and therefore keep them safe from the scorching light of the moon. But this did not go so well, as both the police and the clergymen were exposed to the light of the moon themselves and got transformed into the bobbies and the inquisitors. Now, this is just me speculating, but it could very well be the case that the high priests thought that their belief in Olmer could protect them from Rare. However, evidently this was very much not the case. Although the Dark Priests at the very top of the hierarchy, in contrast to the normal priests of Olmir, do seem to be protected from the moon and its scorching light. This could be because they're worshippers of the old gods, including Rare, or maybe because they might be in cahoots with the sulfur cult. They might have even sent the normal clergymen and the police outside on purpose as sacrifices to the moon. But I'm getting off topic. What makes this even more tragic is that the bobbies and the inquisitors are not blind only physically, as from their dialogue it's clear that they are not aware that they already got Moonscorched heavily. The bobbies will tell you that you're already contaminated, tainted irreversibly, believing that they still hold on to their humanity while you are the one who got corrupted and transformed beyond saving, while in truth it's the other way around. Just like Captain Rudemir from the first game, they tried to fight against the corrupting influence of an old god, but ended up getting corrupted themselves and just becoming another part of it. But enough about that. Let's continue to another line that is quite obvious. In the slums and on the outskirts of the village, you can find half-naked villagers compulsively scratching away at their skin, to the point that they're peeling off big parts of their faces. At this stage they're not hostile, but in the next they very much are, as when they manage to completely peel off the skin from the upper part of their bodies, they become Moonscorched ghouls, which are bloodthirsty and will attack you on sight. There is no need for diagnosis here, as this one is quite obvious. However, before we move on, one interesting thing about the ghouls is that they have a gigantic amount of dialogue. More than that, if you pacify them instead of killing them, and then engage them in battle again, and talk once more, you'll see that ghouls from different parts of the map will have different unique dialogue. Perhaps Miro was experimenting here with enemies having more dialogue, but eventually decided to not implement it with other enemies. Let's move on to one last possible evolutionary line. Now, I don't have a lot of evidence for this one, and I'm mainly connecting them by how they look, so I might be entirely wrong. The half-cocooned could be found in some of the outer layers of the city, from their diagnosis telling us that their metamorphosis is only halfway done. Together with how they look and their location, it's clear that they are in the second stage of transformation. As for the first stage, it could be something similar to the villagers, with the half-cocoon going in a different direction than the bobbies. But it could also be something else that we just don't have in the game. And when it comes to the next stage, I think the best fit might be the neighbors. One hand of the half-cocooned is already entirely cocooned, becoming a fingerless thick blob of flesh, which looks like an early stage of what will eventually become the hands of the neighbors. Another thing connecting the two is that diagnosis reveals that both the cocooned part of the half-cocooned and the entirety of the body of the neighbor are vulnerable to piercing and otherworldly damage. But that is pretty much all I have for connecting the two, so I might be entirely wrong here. If you have information that connects the two that I've missed, I would very much appreciate that if you enlighten me in the comments. So, in conclusion, non-contestant Moonscorched go through evolutionary stages, with each stage straying further and further away from humanity. Using direct evidence like the film of the experiment, together with trends seen in the medical diagnosis and looks of each stage, and finally their location, I came up with this chart. One evolutionary line starts with the villagers, then the bobbies, and finally transforming into the Bellends, with the Bellends being a final stage of Moonscorched evolution. A variant of the second stage of this line is the Inquisitor. It is quite similar to the Bobby in some ways, but also going in a very different direction, with the Inquisitors starting as clergymen and the Bobbies starting as policemen. The half-cocooned are most likely a second stage, with the first possibly also being something similar to the villagers, although I don't really have any evidence tying the two. If they start as something different, I don't believe this stage appears in the game, or it could be that I'm just wrong and this is a first stage. In any case, I believe the best fit for the next stage is the neighbor, but I might be wrong about that. Finally, I talked about another line as well that is completely separate. The half-naked Moonscorched villagers in the slums that scratch away at their skin are the first stage, and the second stage are the ghouls who already managed to peel off the skin from the entirety of their upper body. Now, if you have any corrections, or maybe even your own ideas on how enemies I didn't even talk about might fit this chart, I would very much appreciate it if you write them in the comments. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for watching this video until the end. And if you enjoyed it, consider leaving a like and a comment to help me raise my affinity with the algorithm gods. Finally, if you're new around here, consider subscribing and checking out my other Fear and Hunger videos.